Constructivism, assessments, and NAPLAN. Far beyond the pines, there is a world, a remarkable world, a world where systemic statistics gaining assessment doesn't exist, a unique and equitable world where everyone starts from the same place, progresses toward their own unique potential, and embrace education as a process through which we learn how to learn and become lifelong learners, active global citizens, and retain the confidence and sense of self from our childhoods. This is not the world as we know it. Rather, sitting down as we speak is a classroom of year threes, piggy-tailed, puffy-cheeked and sticky-fingered, silenced and straight, ready for them to take on the task of assisting the system to designate them competent or not, advanced or average, which in time will come will inform these risk-taking use of their strengths and weaknesses and where they fit in relation to the values of society in which they find themselves. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a step back and comprehend from a less subjective perspective assessments. Generally, assessment in all of its form is a way to gather information from learners pertaining to current abilities, their progress toward new learning, and the identification of potentially required modifications and programs. The process may be represented as diagnosis, where the student is at, monitoring, what is their progress, predicting future achievement and how to get there, and more diagnosis, so the effectiveness of teacher and teaching. Assessments may be informal and inevitable, such as teacher observation, student in-class participation, quizzes, and work appraisal, or formal, which are generally systemic and allows for data-based comparison of performance. They fall into formative, summative, and system-wide. A formative assessment allows the teacher to garner how the student is progressing in relation to curriculum requirements, and based on this, redirect or alter teaching methodologies. Here, the teacher will employ informal assessment. Summative assessment, meanwhile, is formal and comes at the end of a teaching sequence to evaluate the student's internalisation of the subject matter, knowledge or skill. And finally, system-wide assessment, such as National Australian Program Literacy and Numeracy or NAPLAN, Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, or even the Australian Tertiary Administration Rank ATAR. These are centrally constructed and processed and applied to a wide group. They allow for the monitoring of student progress, meeting of standards, and holding education institutions accountable. Perspectives, analysis, and preferences around assessment are as abundant as the types of assessment that exist. System-wide assessment, for instance, will be considered essential and beneficial from an economic and human capital standpoint, and likely dehumanizing and perpetuating a cycle of inequality from a socio-cultural humanist standpoint. With this in mind, let's consider all assessment through the lens of that pervasive educational theory, constructivism. Jean Piaget, often considered the father of constructivism, branched from cognitivism to suggest that learning, not only being a mental process, is constructed. Hence the name, not to be too on the nose. It's constructed through students' experience, through exploration and generalization of knowledge, information, and skills. Learning is therefore an active process and requires context. Furthermore, for that context to be authentic. Aligned with Vygotsky, constructivist learning promotes interactive and social learning opportunities where the student can problem solve, collaborate, and self-monitor progress in a real-world context. What does this mean through assessments then? Three popular learning methodologies for constructivists are learning discovery, inquiry learning, and problem-based learning. And so formative assessment and alignment must be authentic, progressive, with feedback and further instruction toward a student-centered and ideal student-structured goal. Let's now consider the three types of assessment. Both diagnostic and ongoing will be based on tasks that provide and relate to the new knowledge or skill to something realistic. So engaging in chemistry through baking or using a local environmental issue to explore an aspect of geography. The teacher will observe student interaction, engagement, and progress throughout each stage of that learning experience. Summative, the final product will be the outcome of the student's journey from a point of inquiry or problem. When they have gathered where they've gathered information, experienced the process, generalized or transferred this new knowledge or skill, and thereby showing learning has been internalized. Meanwhile, system-wide assessment are highly unlikely to ever be able to meet the contextual requirement, nor the drive for authentic problem-safe learning and experience, not to mention allow for open-ended assessment or scaffolding. Constructivists would not engage in this form of assessment. Thus, depending on your intention of assessment, constructivism can be considered highly effective in the fact that it is authentic, engaging, and promotes learning how to learn. It allows for differentiation, scaffolding, and promotes individual students reaching individual potential. It's student-centered and student-driven, which increases motivation. However, it could also be considered ineffective in its inability to ensure consistently and relies heavily on quality of teacher and teaching. Difficulty in assessing in systematic ways so as to identify national and global performance, and the validity of feedback could allow for interpretation of bias. Now, let's flip the perspective, and rather than the intentions of the assessment, let's see constructive views on one form of assessment, that being the controversial NAPLAN. NAPLAN, as discussed by Brady and Kennedy, is a system-wide assessment introduced to the Australian education system in 2008 as a process of accountability, measuring the health of literacy and numeracy levels Australia-wide. Theoretically, it is objective in its development and processing through centralised management and seeks to ensure a wide applicable method of obtaining relevant data. But let's get specific. So, what is it? It's an annual standard test of literacy and numeracy, handwritten, classroom-based in an exam format. It includes reading, conventions of language and numeracy, includes multiple choice, short answer, as well as narrative questions, and each element of the assignment runs for about 45 to 65 minutes, depending on the grade. But what's the point? Well, the quantitative measures of how Australia is tracking in terms of literacy and numeracy, its ability to report back to schools on performance and identify areas to improve, and also track the progress of an individual student's performance, and this can all be reported back to parents and carers. It's sat by year 3, 5, 7, and 9 students, and all students within these groups are required to sit the exam, except for in circumstances of severe disability or circumstances of English as a second language. The main players, it is actually created by ACARA, or the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority, administrated by teachers within a school setting, and it's marked by trained assessors. Now, plan and deliver. There are rigorous rules in place to ensure a safe, equitable, and non-cheatable environment. However, some schools have been known to adorn NAPLAN relevant posters, teach to the test, and some students even being exempt from the test based on potential lower performance. The feedback itself, the data from the answers collated, and the students are actually then placed on bands between 1 to 10, depending on performance. The student is ranked based on year, state, and each area of assessment. Detailed feedback provided on short answer and narratives, and the information is also reported on the My Schools website, which does allow for comparison across schools, regions, and states. So the question is, what would PJ or even Vygotsky think about NAPLAN tests, say they were required to do a quick SWOT analysis? Well, let's start with weaknesses just to shake things up. While attempts have been made to make the questions realistic, relevant, and authentic using the names of young people and a written scenario about them going to the shops, that is a far cry from a problem-based, culturally, regionally, and socially economic relevant assessment experience. The test very much goes against the constructivist philosophy in its engagement with multiple choice questions, which lack the ability to accurately assess metacognition or other cognitive processes. The approaches are far from being either student-centered or student-developed in its standardization, one-size-fits-all approach with little allowance for differentiation. The why I'm doing this, core to constructive focus on providing context for learning, NAPLAN may be interpreted by students as being a test for test's sake, and so can lead to a poor self-esteem should the student fall into a lower band or perform badly in one particular test. As I said earlier, this type of assessment can be formative and quite possibly in a negative way. But to be fair, let's consider its strengths from a constructivist viewpoint. Given its limitations due to its necessity as a nation's system-wide standardized test, it has attempted to be engaging in providing images, diagrams, and narrative within the content. Constructivism does recommend knowing where the student is at in order to provide scaffolding, support, and experiences to bridge that gap. And so if this test was considered diagnostic, it might actually be of some benefit. Now, upon much consideration and a few cigars, Piaget senses some level of opportunity for NAPLAN if taken on through a constructivist lens. So, NAPLAN, having already identified the required achievement standard, why not, through national orchestration, develop a region-based exam think tanks, so in the actual regions. These think tanks, using the standard requirement, can create questions that are relevant to their socio-economic, cultural, environmental, community-based and political contexts, so their area for their students. There should also be an incorporation of at least one short-term inquiry-based collaborative assessment, which is relevant to a social issue. The assessments will still be processed centrally, and so that will assist with validity. Also, each year, the students that are going to be sitting the test, they should be undergoing an induction. Discuss the rubric and what achievement look like. Discuss why the test is relevant to their lives, to their community, to their nation, and even the international community, and allow for conversations around differentiation. Of course, there would be potential limitations to these improvements. Are the resources available for the creation of region-based assessment differentiation? Is this methodology time efficient and cost effective? And how can the outcomes be comparable to international standards if they're context-based? And finally, what training will be required and how will it be delivered to enable teachers to induct the students and administer differentiated tests on time and successfully? The question I put to you before I go, however, is the experience of a young person entering the education system curious and creative less important than how they measure up to state, national, and international standards developed by, quite likely, white middle-class persons? Or should the assessment, rather than carrying this negative, may I even expound diabolical connotation, be about the celebration of success on the journey toward knowledge, knowing, and learning how to learn? Thank you.